I hate to interrupt what are no doubt a bunch of incredibly interesting conversations, but we're going to get back into the program for today. Excellent. So I'm very excited to moderate this panel on metrics. Metrics are really where the rubber meets the road on a lot of these ideas. Many people have said today we need to design for social cohesion. Before you can even know whether your design is working, you need metrics. So I'm going to ask the people on the panel to introduce themselves very briefly, and then we'll get going.
Great. Hello? Okay, sounds like it's working. Hi everyone, my name is Adrienne Brooks. I am a senior advisor on our Technology for Development team at Mercy Corps. I lead our Digital Peace Building Initiative, which is a partnership between our Technology for Development and Peace and Conflict teams. And just maybe a little bit more broadly, Mercy Corps is an international humanitarian organization working on peace building programs and sort of at the intersection of humanitarian and development sectors.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ravi Iyer. I am the managing director of the Psychology of Technology Institute, which is a project of USC's Marshall School Neely Center and the Berkeley's Haas School of Business. I have had a long career as a academic. I've studied polarization. I've worked with many of the bridging organizations here. I also spent the last 5 years before coming to the Psychology of Technology Institute working at Meta, and so I'm looking forward to sharing insights from both of those experiences to see how we can improve tech for the better.
Whatever we're doing. Hello all, I'm Aviva Vaidya. I am a affiliate at Harvard's Berkman Klein Institute for the Information and Society and at the Rebooting Social Media Initiative. I'm a visiting researcher at Cambridge University's Center for the Future of Intelligence. And my work, especially for the past few years, is focused on how we can use the ranking systems, as I'll discuss, to sort of help support bridging divides as opposed to exacerbating them, and also around how we can govern tech through the use of deliberative democratic practices. And the prior work, for example, as chief technologist at the Center for Social Media Responsibility at the University of Michigan, has been really around understanding the impacts and implications of technology like social media and other forms of transformative AI.
Hi, I'm Emily Saltz. I'm a UX researcher at Google Jigsaw. Jigsaw is a unit that focuses on threats to open societies, and we develop a lot of free and open source tools for the whole information ecosystem.
I got my own. Hi, I'm Julia Kamin. I am the Director of Research and Measurement at Civic Health Project, an organization that funds research and efforts to reduce toxic polarization in the U.S. I also have a second relevant hat here. I'm on the social board of Pro-Social Design Network, work with other researchers to identify effective, evidence-based pro-social designs online.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. Quite a cast. Okay. So to frame our conversation, we had a conversation earlier when we said, what are metrics used for? And we came up with basically three answers. One is to evaluate more or less traditional peace-building programs, small group dialogue, that type of thing. Another is to monitor what is happening on platforms. Are people interacting well or poorly? And another, an emerging use, is to drive the selection of content within platform algorithms themselves. So we're going to hear about all three of those today. Next slide, please. So probably many of you are familiar with evaluation instruments like this. You give people a survey, you take them through some sort of dialogue or bridge building program, and you evaluate how they feel afterwards. You probably ask them things like, how do they feel about the people on the other side or the other people in the group, or general support for pluralistic norms. Next, please. There's another kind of metric, which this one appears if you're involved with operating a platform or you're doing research on platforms. This is a chart of polarization on Reddit. One of the interesting things about this is the different colors are people who joined at different times. And this paper is showing that the jump in polarization in the US on Reddit circa 2016 was largely driven by new people coming onto the platform. Next slide. And then an emerging use is measures which aren't really measuring people's attitudes necessarily, but maybe the effects of particular items of content. So this is from a video that Twitter did for their Birdwatch feature, now called Community Notes, trying to illustrate this idea of finding those notes which were approved not by lots of people, but by a diverse group of people. So with that, I'll turn it over to Adrian to kick us off. Oh, well, last note. So I'm going to be collecting questions for afterwards from the Tech for Cohesion hashtag. So if you want to get your question asked on stage, post there.
All right, thanks so much. So I'm going to be talking today about social cohesion measurement and really honing in on why context matters for the online and offline spaces. So as I mentioned in thank you. As I mentioned in my introduction, Mercy Corps is working in more than 40 different countries around the world. Our peace building program is right around 20 countries, and we really have twin aims. We're looking at preventing and reducing violent conflict, as well as advancing sustainable peace. And we're really working with communities to help become resilient to shocks that they're seeing in their everyday lives. And those are increasingly including caused by dynamics online, especially social media. And so based on that, we're really expanding and adapting our approaches to understand how we need to be working at that intersection between those online and offline communities. So this is our framework to sort of help lay out how we're thinking about these interacting elements. We want to think about the problem we're trying to solve and break down the different pieces so that we can better identify appropriate entry points, which in turn inform our program design and our evaluation. And so just to really quickly walk through this, because there's a lot of elements and moving pieces, but we're looking at things like the information architecture that's interacting with underlying conflict drivers, which can sort of interacting and can be mobilized by key influencers leveraging those accelerating characteristics of social media, especially during windows of risk, to mobilize towards violence. But what's really important, and you'll see this sort of overarching circle with the elements of resilience, which include and are in large part made up of social cohesion activities and approaches, can leverage those factors to promote peace or mitigate against, or prevent that violence or mitigate against the impact, help mitigate the impacts of that violence. So next slide, please. And so we look at social cohesion a little bit more deeply, and so I'll just take a pause from the digital piece for a second and add another definition of social cohesion to our lovely discussion so far at this conference. But we're really looking at social cohesion as a sense of shared purpose and trust among and between groups, and their willingness to cooperate with each other to survive and prosper. And we really operationalize this through 6 different elements. So what we're looking at understanding in any given context is trust, belonging, shared identity, attitudes towards the other groups, collective action norms, I have to read from my slide, and civic engagement. And so to sort of highlight, to illustrate this, I'll share an example from a USAID-funded program in Niger that Mercy Corps implemented with a number of partners in 40 different villages across a few administrative areas. Next slide, please. So our experience indicates that interventions should be designed from an evidence-driven approach. So we're starting by understanding the problem that we're looking at, by measuring from the start so that we can identify what are those programmatic entry points and how can we measure how this is changing along the way. And so in this graph, In this graph, you see across the different axes of the circle the different social cohesion elements that we were looking at for this particular context that we identified with the partners that we were working with. And then you'll see that sort of in the concentric circles, the different scores of the respondents of the 40 different villages. And so you'll see that trust is overwhelmingly the lowest element here, but that there's also lower scores for interaction, quality interaction between communities. So what this shows is that it's important to not just look at a single dimension, but to explore the multiple dimensions that we can be looking at to understand the context in which we're working and inform that program design. And if you go to the next slide, we'll see that even within one context, and don't worry about this really small print on the slides, but even within one context, there's a huge variety of differences and different scores. So in the top left, you'll see that same aggregate level graph showing the low trust scores and sort of the similar scores across the other factors. But then you start to look at the 3 other graphs, which represent 3 villages all within one administrative department in Niger. And the shape of social cohesion, so that shape of that circle, the concentric circles, is really different for each of those graphs. And so I think this just really highlights that the scores beyond, trust scores are different across these, and then the scores beyond really vary quite a lot. And in turn, we're designing those programs across those different communities to be especially tailored to this measurement that we're seeing here, and that we can then track over time. So my time is up, and I will pass to.
Great. So much. All right, thank you, everyone. I'm going to slide over here because unfortunately I need to look at my slides in order to be able to actually do this. So I'm the managing director of the Psychology and Technology Institute. We're a network of behavioral scientists. I have a psychology background myself, and I spent the last 5 years working at Meta, and so I will give you some insights from both of those experiences. Next slide. So technology clearly affects cohesion. Both people at platforms and people who are critics agree on that. Next slide. I think people disagree on the valence maybe is that they focus on, but I think if you ask both the critics and the platforms, they would agree that it affects cohesion both negatively and positively. Obviously, Facebook has been used for many negative things, terrible things in Myanmar, but it's also been used by many people in that context to organize protests against an authoritarian government. Many people here have used Facebook groups for many amazing things, but at the same time, people also use Facebook groups for many very polarizing events as well. Can we go back a slide, actually? And so people disagree maybe about the overall effects. It has some positive effects. It has some negative effects. I honestly think that's the wrong question. You'll hear Facebook say things like, we're not the primary cause of polarization. I don't know how you adjudicate that. You do some negative things over here. You do some positive things over there. Next slide. I honestly think like if you're hurting 10 people, the fact that you help 10 people afterwards, I don't think that's like the point. Like I think you worry about the 10 people you hurt. So I think a better question than is it the primary cause of polarization would be, next slide, what are the parts of social media that create polarizing experiences and how do we fix those, right? Because social media, honestly, it's not a very actionable question if it's good or bad for the world. We're not getting rid of it. If we got rid of Facebook, something else would replace it. So how do we fix the things that we think are a problem with it and not worry about like the overall effect being good or bad? And there are 2 things that I think are negative effects that we have pretty good evidence for. 1, engagement-based algorithms generally increase polarizing experiences. And 2, many publishers and politicians say they're incentivized to create more polarizing content. So if you go to the next slide, how do we know that engagement-based algorithms generally increase polarizing experiences? Well, there's this recent Wall Street Journal article about changes that Facebook made where they actually took some of these simple engagement-based optimizations out of the ranking system. They took specifically the predictions that you're going to comment on something, the predictions that you're going to share something, and what happened was that people's feeds were more worth their time, so people felt better about their feeds, anger reactions fell, bullying, inaccurate information, and graphic violence fell. Now, this was just for political content, but you can also find other articles that apply the same kinds of techniques to health content, and you see similar benefits. And the results of these experiments were so convincing that at some cost to the company, and I think Facebook should get some credit for this, and I'll tell you why in a sec, at some cost to the company, the company decided to remove these engagement signals permanently from the incentives for political content. And the reason I think we should give Facebook some credit for this, and I'll criticize them in other settings as well, but if you don't give them credit for this, then we want them to do more. Like, this is a little bit like a part of the solution, but there's more that we want them to do. And we don't want just Facebook to do this. We want YouTube to do this. We want TikTok to do this. We want other platforms to do this as well. So I think it's important, just from a Machiavellian perspective, whatever your opinions about them are, just to give them some credit when they do some good things, even though they do many bad things too. All right, next slide. So what do these polarizing experiences look like? So, again, I work with a network of psychologists. They include experiences like social influence, zero-sum competition, fear appeals. It's effectively like people telling you that other people on the other side are threatening your well-being and your way of life. And there's years of study about these things. So maybe if you don't see it in a short-term study, psychologists would have confidence that these things have long-term effects on society. And next slide. I think the biggest effect is really the effect on publishers and politicians, because in a zero-sum, attention in some ways is a zero-sum game. If I shout, you can shout louder than me and get the attention. Then I have to shout louder than you to get the attention back. And so it only takes a little bit of incentives towards outrage and division for politicians and publishers to realize, like, that's a winning strategy. And so I have a quote from Ben Sass's book here, who's a US politician, but I could have found, there's many other quotes, and these are all from people who run many A/B tests, so they're not just anecdotes, they're the result of many experiments that they have done to see what works. And so Ben Sass here talks about how some celebrities try to break out of posting such outrage, but what happens is no one clicks, metrics plummet, and they end up throwing themselves back into the outrage loop. So next slide. So, sorry, one more slide. These are big effects, and I think that especially the effect on publishers and politicians, because you only have to tilt the playing field a little bit in one direction for all the water to collect on that side. So how do we fix this, and how do we know that we fix this via metrics? Well, one thing that I have noted is that, and I have a Substack post where I can go to detail about some of these things, is that content moderation is not going to solve it. You're not going to solve it by enforcing on rules, because human beings are so much more creative at creating hate and creating misinformation. I don't have to lie to you to mislead you. I can use true statistics. I can take one example and use it out of context. But the reality is that most people don't like polarizing content. And so if you can make your system, you can take advantage of that to enable communities to moderate themselves if you create the right design. And so I have 3 recommendations. Next slide. One is algorithmic transparency. And so so some people say that algorithms are black boxes, and I just like to say that's not necessarily true. There are ways you can debug algorithms. There are questions you can ask, and you can ask, like, you can debug an algorithm to ask why a piece of content is going viral. If you see something bad going viral, you can ask. We should be able to figure out why that happened and reverse engineer it and make that not happen again. The second thing, as far as transparency, I think we need is the results of every A/B test that platforms do. Because every platform, one reason I have confidence in a lot of the things that I say is because, I have these results from some of these A/B tests. Many of these are public, right? And so the more we can get these A/B tests, the more we can create collective evidence, not to villainize Facebook, but for us all to learn about how to make all social platforms better. Next slide. And if we have those A/B tests and we know what works, then we can make regulations about design, not about speech. So we don't hold building contractors responsible for every fire that occurs, but we do hold building contractors responsible if they design a building that is very flammable, that encourages fire. Similarly, we can hold platforms responsible not for every bad thing that gets said on platforms, because they can't police everything that gets said in the world, but we can hold them responsible if they're incentivizing bad speech, if they're creating flammable social spaces. And so a few examples, and I have a Substack post that details more about why these are good ideas. We can ask for explicit feedback rather than assuming what people engage with is something that they want. We can provide an accessible mechanism for people to give negative feedback. So sometimes people engage with things like violent content or divisive content, but they don't actually like it. So give them a way to say, I don't like that. Limit the power of new users. It's a small group of people who do a lot of the bad things. if we just limited the power of these new users and made people have reputation that they actually had to defend and care about, then a lot of better things would happen online. And providing an accessible mechanism for users to remain private. There's some features that are only available in some countries for people to remain private. There's no reason why everybody in the world shouldn't have a way to be as private as they want to be in a very accessible way, right? I'm sure you could do it. It's probably hidden in some menu. But we should make it really accessible and easy for people to remain as private as they expect to be. Next slide. And then how do we know that this works? So my suggestion would be that we survey user experiences. Because a lot of times people misinform people in order to divide people, and then people end up arguing about it. And so most people don't actually, it's a small, I think the more in common people showed, it's a small group of people on the wings who are creating a lot of these negative experiences for a lot of other people. And so if you actually create a space where people are not having negative experiences and they're having more positive experiences, then it actually ends up being more robust against misinformation, against information operations, and against hate speech. So we're actually investing in some of these measures at USC's Neely Center. We want to understand how platforms are changing over time to be able to answer questions like, if Elon Musk is making Twitter better or worse, how would we know? Like, we see Twitter threads, we're like, oh, my feed looks better, my feed looks worse. Like, there's a more systematic way to do it where we actually survey a representative sample of the population, get their collective experiences, and really understand our platforms getting better or worse. People are worried if TikTok is going to be used by China to polarize people in society. Again, how would we know, right? Like, we should need to survey people systematically, understand, are people's experiences getting better, are they getting worse? And not just their negative experiences, also their positive experiences. Can we give YouTube and Reddit, two of the platforms where people learn a lot, an incentive to compete in the realm of learning new things? Facebook actually does connect a lot of people in the world. Can we give them an incentive to lean into that and connect people even more and compete with other platforms on connecting people, not necessarily on time spent? So we want to give people measurable incentives to both reduce negative experiences and increase positive experiences. So next slide. This is it. Well, this is not very good here, but just in summary, technology does affect cohesion. Maybe people disagree about the overall effects, but I think the most important thing is that we, instead of worrying about whether tech is good or bad, we figure out concrete ways to fix it. And I think there are concrete ways to fix it if we can get transparency from the platforms as far as how they work, as far as all the information that they have about what works and what doesn't work, and then we can regulate design of those platforms, not necessarily speech, and we can survey user experiences to measure whether we're actually moving in the right direction. So thank you.
Is this going to be in the live stream over here? Yeah. Great. Okay. Getting some side of the room equity. They got Ravi. You'll get me. Sorry. Okay. 1 second. Too many. So, using up my time. So, I work at the intersection of AI, information ecosystems, and governance. And today I'm going to give a quick overview of bridging-based ranking that was touched on yesterday a few times, and some of the real-world use of it by platforms. Much of that work was done in collaboration with Luke Thorburn. Next slide. So engagement-based ranking is used to order our posts and content across social media, and even by many search engines, both directly and indirectly. And what all that really means is content is ranked higher if people interact with it. That simple. The problem is that sensationalism and othering, as we've seen, can sort of drive engagement, and that can increase harmful polarization and lead to destructive conflict. So the question is, what do we do about it? And the common reaction, which part of the goal of this idea of bridging-based ranking is meant to push back against, is this call to end all ranking. But it turns out it doesn't actually solve our problems. First of all, it's not applicable to many platforms. They don't even have a sense of what they are without personalization. Things like YouTube recommendations or TikTok, it just doesn't make any, there's no follow graph. There's nothing to determine what you're seeing next. And the alternative, which is very simple in theory, is just to have those AI recommendation systems which are ordering our posts to explicitly optimize for bridging, right, instead of engagement. And the most basic version of this is to just rank content higher if it's liked across divides. There's much more deep sort of theory about what that might look like and how to do better, but just thinking about that. Rank content higher if it's liked across divides or found helpful across divides. Next slide. So in some ways, we're actually just talking here about correcting a massive oversight. If we define a bridging system, bridging-based ranking, as something that increases mutual understanding and trust across divides, or most of the other definitions that have been brought up today, it's something that's embedded across society, right? We have cultures, traditions, institutions, nonverbal cues, family practices, structures. All of that is designed, or has been developed, has evolved to have a sufficient level of bridging for our society's level of trust. And lots of caveats there, but the idea here is that we need the algorithms that are now mediating our communication to also be doing some of that. The fact that we might need that should not be surprising. What's surprising is that we haven't done so until now. So the bridging-based ranking is just a term that is meant to sort of make that idea sticky, a clear alternative to the default of engagement-based ranking, which is the obvious thing to do when you're building a ranking system. And it's actually the textbook definition of a recommender system, is what is the thing that people will sort of maximize the utility under a set of criteria. We can go into more details there, but very high level, we can do better, right? So next slide. So if you want more detail on the rationale, there's a report, fancy report, to sort of legitimize the idea. Harvard Belfer Center that I wrote to do exactly that. And it's just to sort of make that policy case, to make it clear that this is a real thing. And Polis showed that it could be done, right? That is it's directly designed to do. It has a ranking system that is bridging by definition in order to achieve its goals. Next slide. So most of the impacts of things like bridging and even the report and so on, they're private. But there is a notable exception that was discussed, which is that Twitter jumped on that bridging train in a very explicit way. They already were using, based off Polis and so on, a bridging algorithm in a relatively new feature at the time that was called Birdwatch, now called Community Notes. And that was mentioned yesterday. It's explicitly described as a bridging-based ranking system now, referencing that work. It's helping create momentum toward more and more organizations using it. And it seems to be working. Like, there's some issues with it, I'm not gonna lie, it's not perfect, but it seems to be doing a good job of what it was meant to do. It's showing content that's helpful across divides in a way that is, in this case, helping address misinformation in addition to polarization. So, I have reservations, but other than the name change, this bridging work at Twitter has actually survived the acquisition. Like, that alone shows that it has some value. More generally, that paper is sort of, it's providing this ammo for other companies and even for people within Twitter themselves to be advocating for more bridging-based ranking. It shouldn't just be in this sort of siloed part of the site, but the core ranking algorithm. So next slide. So following the success of that report, Luke and I shared a preprint of this much longer and deeper paper on bridging systems, sort of learning from cases offline and online, and building a sort of theoretical and a model of like what exactly bridging is. And a final version of this paper is going to be out with the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia's Symposium on Algorithmic Amplification. Next slide. The idea is to first, to reconceptualize what online platforms even are and how they connect to our ideas of offline environments. We argue that the core act of communication in both bridging and dividing centers around the allocation of attention.
Building groups a survey of measurement items, which they can choose from depending upon the outcomes that really matter in their work. We then give them a pre and post survey, which they administer before and after their events, which can be anything from a 1-hour webinar to a month-long engagement. And those results then feed into an online spreadsheet. By the way, all this is built on Google products. Thank you very much, Google. And we fashion the spreadsheet so it can instantly give them a readout on the impact of their interventions. Now, this is obviously built on, this is measuring polarization or impact using survey items. So next slide. What we're really looking about is changing people's attitudes or beliefs or feelings. But the real question is, and this is what I love so much of the conversation here, is what are those attitudes we want to change? And so when we started off, we had some ideas. We mostly talked to a lot of political scientists in the US, of which I'm one, and we thought like, oh, we'll test effective polarization. It turns out when you talk to bridge building groups, they don't really care that much about effective polarization. They care about things like empathy and understanding for people with different points of view. They care about, this is what they tell us, they care about openness to different views, intellectual humility, and so we built those, so we took those outcomes that they care about and then went out to try to find the best validated measures out there. The reason we did that is because we know measurement is hard and it's not intuitive. So rather reinvent the wheel, which we would not be good at, we go to social scientists who've tested these measurement, these survey questions. And also, we don't want, we're also about people using the same outcome measures, so we can converge on the same kinds of outcomes using the same questions. That way we can kind of compare across domains, and so we do not want to go ahead and create our own set of measurements. We don't need those. So this is, I won't talk much about this, but this is a different version of the slide that the output that Jonathan showed. And similar, I love the work that Phoenix does. We really want to put these tools in the hands of these groups, and so they can on their own see the readout, the impact of their work. So this is one of the over a dozen groups that we worked with an intervention on that last year done called America Talks. You can see they had statistically significant effects. There's one other project that we're working on. I don't want to talk too much about it. It's much more complicated, and I don't have a lot of time, but thanks. This is a project that we're working on with research scientists and a few tech teams, some people in this room, to be able to test the polarizing impact of content on social media, but other kinds of content. So similar to the work that folks on the stage, developing algorithms or classifiers that identify toxic content. And here, I just want to say our starting point was similar to the SCIM. We have an idea of what toxic content is, and I think everybody in this room has an idea of what toxic content is, but when we want to build these tools, we want them to be adopted and used. So we started off having conversations with civic groups across the political spectrum to try to identify if we're building an algorithm, what do we really want to build it for? What do we want to build it to protect against? And so we were surprised in those conversations. Two things that emerged there were that we saw broad consonance across left and right in the US are guarding against dehumanizing content and guarding against content that leads to partisan violence. Those are just two examples, but what happened in our brief set of conversations, but this is what I really liked about the work that you do is that I think this is part of the conversation that we're having here, which is really asking ourselves, what are we measuring? And are the ends or goals that we're measuring really consonant or really meaningful to the users that are being affected by those classifiers and by those measures? So look forward to more conversation along those lines. Thanks.
So thank you all so much for those very packed presentations. All right, so I'm going to ask a few questions of the panel now, and we've got about 10 minutes left. So the first one is, if we could reduce conflict or polarization measures to zero, would we want to, and why or why not?
I'd say no. What we want to get rid of is polarization or conflict that exists to sell T-shirts, more or less, right? Like cheap conflict. And so I've talked to some people at organizations that engage in activism, and many of them are not happy with the incentives of social media because they feel like they have to engage in tactics that they don't want to do. Like their serious message gets drowned out by other people who are engaging in more cheaper tactics. So I think we want there to be some amount of disagreement and conflict in the world, but we don't want it to be cheap and used to sell ads and sell T-shirts.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, it's been a theme here too. Was Amanda Ripley's work was referenced earlier today. Jonathan, you've written about this. We don't want to get rid of conflict. We don't want to get rid of polarization. We want to get rid of like the toxic, the high conflict, the conflict that just exists to feed itself. But also, I think that's really important to, again, the conversations that we had. There are lots of really well-meaning people on the left and right in the U.S., or actually the right and the left, that are not fans of depolarizing work, right? So I think we need to acknowledge those well-meaning people who really think that the work that we do here to reduce polarization, to bring people together, works against more important ends that they see, for example, social justice. And those are legitimate voices. And so, yeah, there needs to be that balance of reducing conflict, but also allowing those voices on either side.
Yeah, so I definitely, just sort of building off of what you're saying, I think that we also need to think about sort of the two sides of, there's eliminating conflict, but that doesn't necessarily equate to building peace or building cohesion. And so it has to be, dual aims. And so I think I would just want to highlight that, the reduction of violence is potentially leaving people out. It's potentially, alienating people, potentially like making things more polarized if they're feeling, if their perception is that. And so I would also look towards the goal to be, building the ability to come together and have those conversations and that social cohesion element.
Yeah, agree with everything that's been said, and I think the phrases of like constructive conflict versus destructive conflict that I probably first heard from you, Jonathan, I think capture it pretty well, like that sort of destructive conflict where, and I think one of the big things that came out of the survey and interviews is like people know that they're not being their best selves in a lot of those cases. So how do you kind of design incentives in these spaces to bring out the best of people, and also not like throw people away in those moments when they're not. So I liked that kind of troll tamer work that was also asking those questions of how do you kind of like nudge people towards having conversations that they're proud of.
So just to sort of throw a wrench into things, I say, who is the we that would be wanting to get rid of all polarization or not? Like, is it, and so is it tech platforms? Is it us? Why do we have that power? Who should have that power? Like, those are the other branch of my work is really around that question and how we can make that a real we. And so it's not just what we want, but it's what does, like, if we had the infinite time for everyone in the world to think about these questions and come up with what these algorithms should be optimizing for, like, what would they come up with, and what would be sort of the democratic, deliberative outcome of that? And we can't do that experiment because we don't have infinite time, but we can do the next best thing. And so there's another branch of the work that I've been doing around what I'm calling platform democracy, really building on the deliberative democracy work that's been done around the world, where governments are running deliberative processes where they take samples of the population that are broadly representative to ask them questions like this. What do we do about the water crisis in our environment? Like, what do we do about the climate crisis affecting our country? We can ask the same things. What do we do about the recommendation systems and the ranking systems that affect our platforms? And so that work is a whole nother tranche of work, but it's really getting at this question of like, this shouldn't be a manipulative thing coming on from on high in an ideal world. It should be, and again, just to remember, we're already being manipulated from on high. This is, the status quo is that we are being manipulated for outrage by default. If you accept the conclusion of some studies, maybe not others, but like, who should have that ownership? Ideally, it should be us, and by us I mean that sort of that global deliberative will. And just one other piece here that's just worth noting for people who are interested is I see the tools like Polis and Remesh as also providing a sort of complementary and potentially useful component to these sort of global deliberative processes that are possible. They don't do the deep reflective stuff that we really need to happen, and that's the citizen assembly style work and deliberative polls to some extent. But there's two branches of work there. People are interested in more around that and around sort of this question of legitimacy around the decisions of what that line should be. I have a bunch of links there that I can share, just I guess from aviv.me, my website will link off them. So just my name.me.
Thank you.
But useful, hopefully.
Yeah. Okay, so this is an audience question that I'm going to direct especially to the people on this panel who work in tech. So we heard that it would be useful to get input from peace builders. What kind of input and how would they get it to you?
So, I mean, my email is ryer@psychoftech.org. That's the easy one. I mean, I have learned a lot. So I used to work at an organization called Civil Politics, and I worked with bridging organizations. And a lot of the reasons why I have confidence that, you know, we're moving in the right direction is I see the kind of content that goes up or down with and with, you know, changes that are made, and it conforms to the wisdom and you know, there's a lot of research on it, but there's also a lot of wisdom in the community. So, you know, tech companies don't have a monopoly on ideas. Specific ideas, I think I welcome dialogue. Like, I'm sure we all have ideas on like what we would change. I think it's helpful to have a product person push back a bit, you know, because that's what happens at a company is like, oh, well, have you thought about this case? Have you thought about that? How would we actually build it? How would it actually work? And I think there's a lot of fruitful discussion that could be had about like what are the actual changes that we could make, and you know, and how would we implement them in legitimate ways. So yeah, I mean, that's my email address, and I think just having that conversation about, you know, what would you change, how would you measure it, and having that dialogue about, you know, what previous experience could say about whether that would or would not work, I think is fruitful.
Maybe I can. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah, okay. I was just going to jump in from the peace building side of the question, because I think, you know, I think one challenge that we face is like aligning on the actual problem we're trying to solve, because I think from the tech perspective, there's a set of like data that tech companies have regular access to, all these amazing insights, and I think peace builders have a more eye to the context and the different dimensions. And so, you know, I do think there's sort of this conversation that needs to happen, and this open collaboration. So that's why I'm excited about like this type of space to be coming together and like create those networks. But I think like together we need to identify, align, and be consistent about the frameworks that we're identifying the problem, the approaches we're taking to it, and what metrics matter for those problems.
Yeah, agree.
Okay, good.
And yeah, I'd add that like I think there's no substitute for actual just close collaborations with people in this community to do that. There's so much translation on both sides about the frameworks and what metrics are important, and a lot of times those change as you work with directly with the organization. So I think at a system level, there's a lot that tech can do to kind of make it easier for those types of partnerships to come together, to create the space and funding and incentives to really do good work there.
All right, I'm going to go to the next question because we're right up against time here, but and I'm going to ask you to answer this in one sentence. If you were the president of all social media, what metric would you optimize for?
So I'm going to, one sentence. This comes from our discussions with groups. The metric that they were most concerned about, that we heard the strongest resonance, is actually civic alienation.
So I can cheat because we work on this. I would measure people's feelings that they have had a meaningfully connecting experience in the last 30 days.
I'm scared of hard questions. I mean, it's hard to pick one. I was talking about constructiveness, but there's so much work, and like, how do you define that and define that for different communities? So on some level, making it contextual to those communities, maybe whatever high quality or satisfaction is, which actually isn't too far from the status quo in a lot of cases. So hand wavy answer.
I don't have a great answer to this question. I think it has to be a family. So I'm just going to, the previous question, what do I want from bridge builders? Unintuitive things that are really good or really bad in terms of what you see, what works and what doesn't. That will help define metrics in ways that the tech people won't otherwise get. And stories that illustrate that will help make it stick.
I'm also having a hard time because I'm a big proponent of methodology and to define the metrics, but I think to deep dive into trust would be probably the most critical piece from my side.
Thank you, and I will try to answer this question as well. I wonder a lot about some sort of measure of being heard, whether that could be an interesting lever to pivot on. Okay, so that's it for this panel. I will ask you to, we're now going to talk with your neighbors and see if you can come up with some more interesting insights or questions for all of us later. And with that, let's give everyone a hand.